folks on Zoom, we've got some screens that are updating here. We will be with you very soon, but you are in the right place, I promise. Good morning, folks. We'll go ahead and get us officially started. I'm glad y'all came out today. Hello to the folks who are on Zoom or who are watching this later during YouTube. I want to welcome you here in person, online, to Milan Presbyterian Church and Great Rivers Presbytery. And we are very lucky today to be able to welcome Frances Namomo. Frances has over 20 years of experience with climate change advocacy and disaster relief. She works for the Pacific Council of Churches and lives in Fiji. Frances is Methodist and has spent a lot of time with us Presbyterians. 2 years ago, she was one of the ecumenical partners for General Assembly, and she has been here, about 3 weeks now, as one of the peacemakers who has been touring around the United States and speaking to congregations. And so she just flew in from Pennsylvania last night. We get to keep her here in Iowa, Illinois for a few days, and then on Monday she goes back down to Louisville, Kentucky. And for the record, Frances will present, then we'll have time for questions, and then she is teaching an honors class at Augustana at 12:30. So if folks would like to join us for lunch in between, we're just gonna go to Hungry Hobo. It'll be nice and simple, but we'd love to have lunch with you. Now let us begin with prayer. Holy and gracious God, we are so grateful for the chance to be connected with your children around the world, to hear what is going on all over your creation, to find ways we can do better. Lord, we thank you that Frances is here with us today. We ask that you open our ears and our eyes and our hearts as we are connected with all of your people, as we learn today. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Okay, can you hear me? Loud and clear. All right. Thank you very much for the invitation and also for the beautiful introduction. Maybe I should stop looking at the screens and record. My name is Frances again, as was mentioned earlier. I like to describe myself.
Just checking. Should we switch microphones? We could. I can.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. We'll be right back. We want to make sure we can actually hear you.
Okay.
I can hear it, but it's all, I don't like the way it sounds.
Yes. Hi. Bolavinaka. Thank you. How does that sound? Loud. Okay. So, my name is Frances Namomo. People always ask me, if you were to describe yourself in 3 words, what would that be? I always say Indigenous Fijian woman, Methodist, as mentioned earlier, and also a climate justice activist. And this has been based on the work that we do that not only recognizes my role as a Christian, but also as an Indigenous in the context of responding to climate change. I'd like to begin maybe my PowerPoint presentation that is titled Singing the Lord's Song in Strange Lands and Times. I should stop looking that side. Singing the Lord's Song in Strange Lands and Times has been the strategic, thematic focus for the Pacific Conference of Churches, the organization that I work for the last 5 years. And this is basically situating the context of how people view climate change in their own homes in the region, in the Pacific region. And it is also from the Psalms 137 text, how do we sing the Lord's song in strange, in a foreign land? Next slide, please. We say Mbulavinaka. I should have said this earlier, as I greet you all. Mbulavinaka is simply means Bula is life or health, Vinaka is great or good. So as we greet people, we greet you all. I greet you all with good life and great health. And it resonates also in the way people see, speak words, but also how they live among each other. So language plays a very important role, at least in the context of the Pacific region. What we say, what we speak, how this describes or defines our context as well. Where is Fiji? You'll probably be asking where Fiji is or the Pacific. I thought it would be interesting to bring this upside down map. First, it changes the whole perspective of the common world map that we normally see, but it also recognizes Fiji is the small circle on the top there. That's very, if I was to situate Fiji to any other well-known island or country in the Pacific, it would be Australia or New Zealand. And the US is the bigger circle. And so what really connects us is the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. I was in San Francisco and I said, your ocean is stronger than the waves coming from the Pacific Ocean here is stronger than the waves that comes to the Pacific, because it would break onto the reefs before it reaches the coast, and it's smooth when it reaches the coast or the beach fronts. But recognizing also that the ocean plays a very important global aspect because it connects everybody. Whether you're in Africa, you're in Asia, South America, or anywhere else around the world, notice that the ocean links everybody. I guess the difference that I've had experience was when flying from Houston to Louisville or anywhere else in the last couple of weeks, I've only seen land. Because in the Pacific, as you ascend from an island, maybe the first 5 or 10 minutes, you're already seeing the ocean around the islands. And I guess that's probably the only difference. However, this particular map also recognizes how close we are, which means we are really neighbors. If we remove the ocean, we're actually close to each other, the US and Fiji. Next slide, please. Briefly about Fiji, because later on in my presentation, the focus on climate-induced migration is focused on the island of Fiji. We were ceded to Great Britain in 1874, which is why we still have the Union Jack on the flag. We got our independence back in 1970. We're still very young independently, but I think over the years we have developed really well with the different groups that have come, or groups of people that have come to live in Fiji. When the British ceded Fiji, they brought in Indians from India. So we have a population of around 900,000 people. 56% are indigenous like me, 38% are Indo-Fijians, and 6% are made up of European, Chinese, and other Pacific Islanders that have come to live in Fiji. The total land area is around 73,000 square miles, 71,000 square miles. I was making comparison to states around the US, and it came close to New Jersey, around 73,000 square miles. So that's briefly about Fiji. Next slide. We love our food. Picture on the top with one person, with one child, and food displayed. I went to San Francisco because it was near the coast. I thought you would have coconut trees. They said, "No, we don't have coconut trees. You might see that in LA, palm trees. But as you go to the Pacific, not only in Fiji, but anywhere else around the Pacific, coconut plays a very important role, not only in food, in making of our food, but also the whole tree is used for different things, from hats to sacks to brooms. We use the wood as firewood, but also part of our furnitures, building even. So it depicts a lot about living in the islands would look like. Every single tree or every single coconut tree means that it can be used. We do not see it only as a resource for our own benefit, but also how do we protect, because it is not only for ourselves, but for the community as a whole. We still live in communal settings, villages, in communal setting, whereas those who have come to live in Fiji either live individually or have also formed their own small communities. I thought to highlight that Fiji is very well known with the rugby. It's one of the major sports because we've gotten 2 Olympic gold medals from playing rugby at the Olympics. But it has also played a very critical part in bringing the different ethnicity groups together. Like I said, we're very young independently. We've had, since our independence in 1973, military coup that has created tension among the different ethnicity groups in Fiji, but also have shaped how people have seen or would like to see the type of leadership we want, not only in our governments, in the church, and also in the traditional aspect. So it's noting that I've got a picture of 3 military officers with guns that to depict that we've had those military coup that has shaped also our development over the last, since our independence. Next slide, please. So this is the shared history. Because I'm coming from the Pacific and very blessed to be part of this International Peacemaker Program that has been put together by the Presbyterian Church USA, I thought, okay, it's not just now that we are developing this relationship, this engagement. We have had a shared history already with the US. And this might not be a good one, a good memory to keep, but it has a generational impact, maybe, if I put it that way, to the Pacific people. So in between 1946 to 1958, there were tests done in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Northern Pacific, nuclear tests done by US in the Northern Pacific. There were environmental impacts, health issues, generational health issues that people continue to face today, the impact of being exposed to nuclear testing, the environment that was contaminated and impacted by this testing, have displaced communities who once lived in these communities. They are now living, they have moved, they've relocated elsewhere, but are setting up again, but continue to face the trauma of having to move from one's fertile land, from one's a very productive island, to now being exposed to another new place where they had to readapt and recover and continue to live, to start all over again. So I particularly chose those 2 pictures because the first picture on top is the testing that took place in the Marshall Islands. And at the bottom, the second picture at the bottom is the concrete structure that has been built, that was built to bury the equipment or the debris that was used for the nuclear test. So the fear is, because of climate change now, that particular concrete structure there's erosion happening on that particular island, on that particular atoll, that will affect the concrete structure. And when it cracks, the nuclear water waste will seep into the nearby coastal, ocean, but it will not only affect the environment around there, it will affect the rest of the Pacific region. As we've seen in the earlier map, how the ocean connects us. So it's not just us that's exposed to this risk. I think the rest of the world too will be exposed to this risk. But in saying this,
there's a lot of conversation also we are hearing about just transition. If we're going to phase out fossil fuel, what is the next alternative? There's already conversation about nuclear energy. Let's introduce nuclear energy as an alternative. And for us, having had this experience, because it's not just the US that did the test in one particular island in the Pacific, but there was France, the French government that did testing also in Maui-Nui or French Polynesia, and the British in Kiribati and other Pacific Island countries. Because of this history of the nuclear impacts on islands and people, we would not see this as an alternative to a just transition when it comes to climate change, the conversation around climate change. So that's briefly a shared history that we've had in the past, not a really good one, but at least in looking forward, how do we learn from this history that we can inform our alternatives or the approaches we take in talking about the impacts of climate change and what solution we would need. Next slide, please. Our realities. So while we're still recovering, while we're rebuilding, repurposing our, our values, our definition of what the kind of island we would like to see, then we are faced by another reality. In the early 90s, communities were approaching churches in Pacific. They were saying that, sea level, the conversation or the story goes like this. We can no longer plant our food on our grounds, on the land. We can no longer, the water seems to be too salty now. Until tests were done, and then they realized that sea level rise, that sea level was entering into the groundwater system, affecting the water source, affecting also the plant, their agriculture. So from that time until now, we continue to hear this. The impact of sea level rise that's affecting islands, food crops, crop production, their agriculture, their fisheries even, changing weather pattern, changing rainfall pattern, affecting farmers' productivity, agriculture productivity, crop yields. Water sources not only affecting the drinking sources, but health issues as well, water issues, water illnesses. We've had cases where people had to struggle or to fight over resources because they are going, to a particular place, particular source to extract or to get their water from. There are cases also of increasing health issues. We've talked about waterborne diseases with the changing in temperature, warmer temperature, more breeding places for mosquitoes, therefore more mosquito-borne diseases, dengue fever and malaria in most of our communities. Respiratory diseases, because we've had the Ministry of Health coming to us and telling us our young people are coming now often to the hospital to get oxygen because the heat is too much that they cannot breathe properly. That's new for us because we know we were able to live, in the normal heat that was, that most of our ancestors, even the current generation, my generation, were able to live through. But to have a younger generation not being able to withstand this heat, that is a new thing for us. And of course, the context of mental health. When we talk about, while the conversation around climate change is complex, and then you bring in the conversation, the issue around mental health, it can be really a big burden again on the people. Because one, we do not have a word in our Fijian dictionary that describes mental health. So it took us at least 5 to 6 years to unpack what mental health is. What would this look like if we're going to talk about in the context of climate change? How do we recognize the impacts of mental health to communities, to the women, to the men, to the young people and the children? So these are all the interconnectedness impact that climate change brings, but also exacerbate in the ongoing daily lives that communities were facing. The next slide. So these are just some pictures. I mentioned changing weather patterns, changing rainfall patterns, increased weather events, stronger weather events like cyclones. We've I mean, I've been here for 3 weeks now, and I've continuously hearing the cyclone that's happening in Florida and other places. It's the same in our Pacific Island countries. And imagine, there's a picture down there, that's one island alone. The whole island was destroyed completely, and it took the government 3 years to rebuild back. Rebuilding meaning people still live in tents in the rebuilding process because they have to look for funding. This is not in our national budget. I think for us, because we knew that our cyclones are not that strong, to reach Category 5 is something new for most of our Pacific Island countries. But since 2016, since this particular cyclone, the government has now had to ensure that there is a disaster pool of funds to support any immediate impact on communities, any disasters, should it happen either during our cyclone season from November to April or beyond our cyclone season period. And we also notice that the cyclone routes have changed. The usual route is no longer what we've seen the cyclones that we're experiencing now follows. It is a different route, and I don't know when the wind feels like it needs to move somewhere else, because it all depends on the ocean, the warming ocean. When the warming ocean increases, this also creates the strength of cyclones that we are experiencing. And of course, families losing their belongings, their investment, their homes, and in some cases losing loved ones because of the intensity of the cyclones that we are experiencing. Next slide. The 3 other impacts or the realities that a lot of communities, a lot of islands in the Pacific are facing. Majority of our economy is fishing, relies on the fishing industry. And so we know that there's coral bleaching, warming ocean, and a lot of the fishes that Pacific Island countries would rely on for their fishing industry are now migrating to cooler temperatures, cooler oceans, which means they will resort to something else. The fit for us in this work is resorting to something else might mean there's already conversations around this in the Pacific and around the world, digging up the ocean, deep sea mining. And for us, knowing that there's already the evidence of extraction on land, imagine this happening in the ocean. We will not see the impact, but the impact will spread to every other region because the ocean doesn't have any boundaries to protect. Just because you're digging maybe in the Pacific, it will not reach the Atlantic Ocean or somewhere else. It might, because there's no boundary to stop the impact of extraction from the ocean. So that's the fear. And so we're trying to support our governments in saying, look at other alternatives. Don't look at deep sea mining, because there's pressure for the government to, not only for the government, but for the Pacific people to resort to deep sea mining as an alternative to the fishing industry. And we have realized that decrease also in our biodiversity. Changing temperature, warmer temperature, rainfall, we're losing the flora and fauna that's significant for one particular island. Now, a couple of 2-3 years ago during COVID, we don't have seal in the tropics in Fiji. Seal from New Zealand swam all the way to Fiji. People were trying to figure out how did that happen. So it must have followed a group of seals and got lost. But it also means they are probably adapting to the changing in the ocean temperature. So these are things that we continue to see, and we've also seen the growth in invasive species based on the changing weather patterns or the rainfall patterns. And last but not least, aspect before, the sea level rise. In the sea level rise is expected to rise 20 inches in the next 50 to 70 years. Every time I talk about sea level rise, I can imagine people are thinking, it's rising up this way, it's not that much. Now, because a lot of our islands are flatlands, and some islands don't have mountains, the water doesn't rise up this way. The water comes in, encroaches the land horizontally. So that means every year you could lose 20, 50, 100 yards of coastal land. So people continue to move inland to the point that they may have to relocate, because every time there's high tide, you will expect water to flood through your village and then go out again at low tide. I particularly chose that picture because those are graveyards that used to be on land in one of the communities that we work in. They're now exposed in the ocean. It's only during low tide that you will see the graveyard. During high tide, you will never see the graveyard at all, the tip. And this is the reality in most of other Pacific Island countries. Land that used to be places for people to build their homes to live on are now being eroding, plus water continues to encroach inward, thus pushing people more internally. Next slide, please. Where did we come in? How did the church in the Pacific started seeing this as an issue? Because 80 to 90% of people in the Pacific are Christians. 80 to 90% are Christians, 100% maybe, apart from Fiji. In other Pacific Island countries, majority are indigenous. There's always the approach to different issues from the angle of, as an indigenous, how does this play into my indigenous being? And how does this also, where is God in the context there of climate change? It's always a question of, as an indigenous and also as a Christian. And because the Pacific Conference of Churches, or the churches in the Pacific, have been, since the 60s, been at the forefront in mobilizing people to raise the impact of nuclear testing in the Pacific, communities came to the church again, recognizing the role the church has played, plus it's an established institution in the Pacific, for, look, can you please take our voice? We need to talk about this issue, it's impacting our communities. And for the Pacific Conference of Churches, together with the World Council of Churches, look, we cannot listen to only communities from Kiribati, one of the islands in the Pacific, or Tuvalu. It's no longer an issue about one particular island. Because we're hearing stories from the different communities, we need to approach this as a collective voice from the region. So the churches in the Pacific met in 2004, came out with the Osintai Declaration. Osintai Declaration, one, acknowledged that there were visible impacts of climate change, communities were affected. Secondly, who are our partners that we can work with? Ecumenical bodies, World Council of Churches, other churches around the Pacific and the world. UN, we need to target our government system, the UN system, Pacific churches, traditional leaders, and also our communities. Because for us to address this issue, we need to see who are the key partners, key players in this work. That declaration set the way forward for how the church was going to respond to the climate change issue. 2008, the Moana Declaration came out. Yes, there was talk around climate change, but it wasn't urgent. No urgency in the conversation. Negotiation was happening, it became a political issue. For the Pacific churches, they saw this, look, if no one is moving, worst case scenarios, our communities are going to relocate. And if they are to relocate, how can we support them in their relocation? We guide, we provide pastoral support. So the Moana Declaration became that tool, a guiding framework to support the church. Should this happen, community approach the church to say, we want to move, we can no longer live here. Then the church can be able to guide them through the Moana Declaration. And lastly, I wanted to just highlight the Tuakoelei Declaration. Tuakoelei is Tuvaluan word for who is my neighbor. From the Good Samaritan text, it really highlighted, this was 20 years after the Osintai. We met in May of this year and said, let's look back, what have we done as the churches in the Pacific? Do we need to reaffirm anything? Should we do something else? Should we change our strategy in addressing the issue of climate change? Who else? Who are our neighbors in this context? And so, the upside down map gave us a clear picture of who our neighbors were. They may be far apart, further away from us, or very close to us, but how do we get them involved also in this context. So the Tuakwele Declaration was affirming again what had taken place since 2004, but also a guiding support, a guiding document for us in our work for the next 10 years. Next slide. Then we come to the relocation work. I said there were no agencies mentioned, there were no agency from 2004, even until 2015, when we had the Paris Agreement in France, COP21. So for us in the Pacific, there were already communities who were approaching governments and approaching our churches saying, we need to relocate. So for the Pacific Conference of Churches, because of this, we had to step up and respond to the call from the communities, to the request from the communities. We've been doing this work of relocation for the past decade, and we thought it was important to involve the church because, like I said earlier, 80 to 90% Christian. When they're framing their decision, it's framed around God, asking the question about God in the context of relocation, and also as an indigenous, how do they respond to what's in front of them? The two communities I will focus on is Vunindongoloa and Vunisabitsab. That's Fiji. The main islands is Vitilevu, and the second biggest island is Vanuatu. Our office is in Vitilevu, but majority of our work is happening in Vanuatu, which is circled on the other bigger island. Next slide, please. Vunindongoloa, first community that relocated in Fiji. I said the Moana Declaration came out in 2008. They had approached the government in 2007, 1 year before the church leaders met and came out with the Moana Declaration. By the time the government approached the church, we had something that we could support the government and also the community. It was important. The reason that government approached the church to respond to this relocation work, because majority of the people in this particular village are Methodist. The government did not know how to approach and how to answer question about God. The community were asking, would God agree to the decision that we've made to relocate? That's the Christian aspect. And then on another side, our ancestors have lived here all their lives. They now have gifted us with this land. Are they also going to approve the decision to relocate? But even in this, in this complex situation, they were asking themselves also, have they lost or have they not done their part? Have they not done enough to protect what was gifted to them, both as a Christian and as an indigenous, to protect the land? Because for us in the Pacific, particularly with us Fijians, our identity is not just the person. It's an extension of land, ocean. We have sacred trees, sacred plant, sacred animal and birds and fish. So when I say I'm Fijian, my name is this, my real introduction is usually everything else and not just Francis from the Pacific Conference of Churches in Fiji. If I go to a village in Fiji, I explain all this, and they can make the connection already, how I'm related to that particular village. So this is what happened here. They were in a situation where they had to answer these two questions. For the Christians, they said, we will fast for 1 year, pray and fast, so that we could have something, an answer or a signal from somewhere that this is approved from God. And then they had difficulty in answering the ancestral aspect, because we have the farewelling system where we go and bid farewell to a land or to a people, but it's only when there's people alive living that we bid farewell to, not when they are dead. There's always this ritual, our exit and entry protocol done to people when they are living on the land. But to do it to land and no one receiving it, that was a difficult question. So they couldn't do the traditional aspect, but they followed the Christian fasting and praying. So 2014, after 7 years of planning and designing, government, churches leading, support from government and other stakeholders, they finally relocated January 2017. This was the story from this particular man, who was the village headman at that time. They had the last church service on the land that they were living. It was a mourning service for them. It was like a funeral because they did not want to leave, but because of the situation at hand, they had to relocate. They were mourning that they were leaving their home, they were leaving their ancestors, now relocating, moving to a new place. Now, after the service, the women and the children got on the truck, while the men thought they'll pace themselves and walk after the truck had left. What took place was this. The driver started the truck, it went for a bit and stopped. He tried the engine again, it went further and stopped. The third time, the engine didn't start. They were confused, what's happening? Only the elders who were walking from behind realized what was happening, so one of them turned around and made the announcement, just made the announcement to the land and everybody. We're not going for good. We will go, but we will continue to come back and visit. At that point, when the driver started the truck again, the truck started and they sped off. But this is that particular story recognizes the interconnectedness people have to land. So even though people were living, there was no farewell. Like I said, there was no ritual done to the land and people. And so the conversation again, the person is moving. What happens to the sacred identity that comes with a person? Now left behind, only the assurance that we will come back and visit was what will keep them. And so every now and again, communities continues to go back and visit the old site. Next slide. One of the elderly ladies said this, I can no longer dream in this new place. That's the new site that people relocated to. I miss the sound of the waves breaking onto the foreshore because she grew up or she got married onto this village and this has been her environment, her surrounding. But at the same time, because a lot of our families in Fiji have mats, women does weaving, they weave mats and it's spread in the houses. She walked into her house and she didn't find her mat. And so she was questioning herself, this house does not belong to me. My mats, I don't see my mats in here. I don't belong here. So the challenge of losing something and having to regain materialistically, but there's no sense of owning or being part of that particular environment. Some of the challenges that they face while they had relocated and we continue to support them with is the trauma of losing the land. The challenges between the two generations, younger generation, older generation. Fisher folks, coastal communities, a lot of our Pacific Island countries, they're very skillful people. They can read the winds, currents, where the fish will be, go fishing and all that. But in this case, because they've moved inland, they're losing this particular traditional skills. And the younger generation is saying, we don't need it. We no longer live there. We need to adapt to new skills. But like I said, because our identity links us not only to the environment, there's also that traditional role that you are blessed with because of the environment you will be part of. Competing interests, mobility for elderlies. The first time that they relocated, a lot of them couldn't move around because it was on an elevated place. And so they found it difficult to go from one house to another or even to attend church and other functions in the village. There were also cases of children, because now the community had moved near the cities, town areas. Services are readily available, but they're exposing children and young people to other issues. Even near the road, the village now being placed near the road, the accidents that could happen for children. Like I said, communities or coastal fisheries, fisher folks, commuting, while they moved inland, they continued to go to the ocean to fish. And there was concerns about the security of women, because a lot of time women go and fish. How are they protected? because now it's a bit longer distance to go from the new site to the old place. Next slide, please. The second community, dropping on to the end of, almost end of my presentation, is Wunisavisavi, another small community, maybe in, not a small community, a bit okay community in Fiji, similar place where Wunindongolo is. The difficulty here with this particular community, they could not relocate because of the traditional knowledge, traditional role. They protect, the first picture shows the an ancestral ground that's protected by this particular community. Part of their identity, part of their responsibility to the paramount chief of that particular province is the protection of this place. Because if there's installation of the new chief, it will be done here. But they are also exposed to the impacts of climate change. Every time there's high tide, water gushes into the village. Health issues, they posing danger to the community, health issues, water sources are affected, food security are also affected. What happened was, because of this particular traditional role, they decided as a community, we'll just move the 4 houses that's exposed, that's most at risk on the foreshore, to the back of the village. That took place, so that it does not affect the role of the community, traditional role, and protecting the ancestrally ground, but at the same time, they don't have to negotiate at the point where they are telling the paramount chief, you have to choose between our safety and the traditional role. It's at that point where they are questioning whether they should be confronting their paramount chief regarding this. The challenges came after the 4 homes were removed or moved to the back of the village. Next slide, please. Yes, the 4 houses that were built to the back of the village were now exposed to another risk, soil erosion, disconnection from the whole village, plus the issue again with younger generation and older generation. While the older generation continues wanting to protect the village and their traditional role, the younger people are saying, this is not important, we can move. So the younger generation are choosing to relocate while the older generation continue to hold on to their traditional role. That's a picture every time you have in the village of Wunisavisavi. This is a normal day, because every time there's high tide, water comes into the village. So this is what, it's no longer the dry land that they used to have before, but it's also muddy from seawater coming in every time there's high tide. How shall we sing the Lord's song in foreign lands and strange time? That particular picture on this particular slide says Tuvalu was here. There's reports that says from the International Panel on Climate Change scientists that Tuvalu will no longer exist. That's one of the islands in the Pacific. Will no longer exist in the next 10 years. So where will the people of Tuvalu identify themselves with? Yes, I'm from Tuvalu, but where is Tuvalu in the map? I can't find Tuvalu. That's probably the fear that a lot of people are asking. And for us, this is important to talk about this issue. How do we sing the Lord's song in the foreign land? Because we're able to unpack these fears. And so, how do we see foreign land in our context? Foreign land and strange land are our own homelands, because we can no longer plant the crops that our ancestors used to plant in this land. The water sources are affected. There are people that are going to relocate. So it's strange in that context. But at the same time, singing the Lord's song, because we're both indigenous and Christian, our approach then is beyond faith. How do we continue to bring songs of hope and resilience, because it's coming from communities. They are identifying their ways of responding, adapting, and mitigating. How do we tune this as the song from communities to sing about what their approach towards climate change? Next slide, please. And this is where majority or most of the work that we do focus under the 3 Ps, the prophetic, pastoral, and the practical. Because of the way the church and the government system, the traditional system is framed in the Pacific, I always say the Pacific is unique because you can sit on the table, the government's ministers on one side, and our churches and civil society on one side. We can be against an issue and probably come up with a way forward on different sides of the table in our own home countries. But when it comes to a global platform, our governments and civil society and churches are on the same side, because we know we have responsibility for not only our different agendas, but also for the people we represent back home. And so our prophetic, our pastoral, and accompaniment of the church becomes very important. Next slide. Prophetic in the sense that we will advocate, continue to advocate for different partners, players, particularly with politicians, because we need political will. Speaking truth to power, using the pulpit to address this issue, but at the same time, telling our stories to shape and to redefine how this conversation around climate change has been taken and has been politicized in other spaces. Pastoral is important because as we guide or provide accompaniment to communities, they need the church, they need the support of the churches on the ground. We also recognize the pastoral needs to happen also with our political leaders, because sometimes they're making decisions based on the people that they surround themselves with. And if the church voice is not there to continuously remind them of their work and what they're called to do, then we're losing that space. So we are trying to find a balance between providing support here, but also bringing the context or stories here to inform our engagement with leaders. And lastly, the practical. For our prophetic and pastoral to work, what practical initiatives are we doing? Because at some point, people will ask us, what have you done? Have you done something? So for us, we need to prove that we have done something. So our practical engagement is very critical in order for us to be prophetic and provide pastoral accompaniment. Next slide. So to conclude, as I run to the closing of my presentation, all of us are weeping. Like I said, the mats that spread in our villages, in our homes, each strand represents something. So for me, the different strand as that woman is holding represent a different region, different countries, different issues that we prioritize. But when it comes to climate change in the Pacific, all these issues are very interconnected. You cannot pull climate change and talk about climate change alone without talking about health, gender-based violence, youth issues, food security, water security, and all other issues. So how do we weave these different elements together? And lastly, last slide, as we weave our mats together, we always spread the mat and then invite people. So if you go to some communities in Fiji, they will have the mat on the floor, they will have couches, and they will joke about this. The couches are just here for decorations because people will sit on the mat. But sitting on the mat allows you to have meal together, to laugh, to tell your stories. But at the same time, we're on the same level. No one is leading, no sitting on the top of the, on the table or anything, but we are all on the same level, so people can have very mutual conversation on the mat. But at the same time, as you sit on the mat, you're able to see who's missing, who's not around. Even here in the US, you're sitting on your table. You can recognize who's missing from the table. So that's the same concept for us in the Pacific. Who's missing on the mat that needs to be invited to come and sit on the mat? Something about the mat. You can remove the mat. There are different sizes and different design, but you can put them together. If it's a big space like this, like the carpets or rugs like this, we can put a couple together, which one signifies the sharing that I might have only one mat. If there are more people coming, I can go to my auntie and grandfather and borrow their mats. The concept of sharing in our communities. But as we spread mats, there's opportunity to take one out because there might not be the many people we would expect to come to these spaces, only the few, which is still good. And then there are times when you need more mats. And so each of these work overlaps each other. The more, the merrier. The few is still very, very active. So I would like to invite you all as we spread this imaginary mat. Thank you again for being here this morning. And maybe this imaginary mat is a way to invite you all continue to be part of this journey of climate justice. Thank you very much.
Time for question. Oh boy, microphone's on. And so I am going to do the first one if folks don't mind, because we had a question on email from a woman named Nancy who couldn't make it today. And she's heard you speak before over Zoom during COVID and said the last time you talked, you mentioned the difficulty of being able to get to climate summits and not being heard. So how has that been for you in the past few years? Have you had more support? And what are the ways that we can help you be heard?
Thank you.
Oh yeah, please turn it back on.
Yes, I've turned it on.
So if I ask her a question, she can't hear your answer, it'll be silly.
Okay, it's on. I must admit, I got frustrated with the UN system, and I stopped attending. However, I have my boss who's attending on our behalf now. But at the same time, he can kill two. Shouldn't say kill. He can, he can do a few things with that trip. And I guess for him also, I like to think that we are at a point now where I realize, okay, maybe that's not my space. He can do the better negotiation and can handle himself under pressure, while I would rather connect what's happening at the global summit to communities and engaging communities so that they can see that what they're doing is connected to what's happening at the global. We've had, there are churches from around the region that continues to support us, but we have to continuously remind people that, for them to support us, not to just support us because we want a voice. Support us because we are in, with good intention, knowing that this is a collaboration between the South and the globe, global North, global South, or among different ecumenical partners. Sometimes we get invitation 1 month before the summit. That for us is telling us, okay, we've tried somewhere else, now we want a Pacific voice. Then you're running to the Pacific. I think for us, it's if you want our engagement, and for us to recognize the intention of being part of that summit, or include us from your planning, include us if you are looking at attending a summit, or we have it included in our project. One, it's already now included in our program. Secondly, there are key partners that have continued to support us, and that has been very helpful. And while we grow the team to go into this summit, we are also trying to mentor the younger people to participate, to show that being an activist, how do they see that being a Christian plays out also in this activism. So there's been some support around those areas. Thank you very much for that question. I hope I've answered the...
This may be fully out of the realm, and thank you. This has just heightened my awareness in ways I didn't know needed to be heightened. So thank you for that. How does tourism, you always hear of Fiji as being the place to go. How does that interact with all of this?
Interestingly, just recently, then we have tourism industry heightened, marketing strategy around the world. We used to have agriculture as our main source of economy revenue in Fiji until we had a change of government in 2006, and a lot of investment was on tourism. There has been, I think the interesting thing over the years about tourism is the consideration of indigenous communities and the ways of indigenous communities. While tourism, yes, is now a big industry in Fiji, supporting our revenue, we've also have to continuously to monitor. Majority of this tourist industry or resorts are along the coast. And a lot of them have realized the impacts of climate change. What we've seen now is the environmental program introduced in the tourism sector as well. They've included it in the text that everyone who comes into Fiji as a tourist, there's a particular environmental tax that they pay. But also, even in the resorts, there are environmental programs. A lot of the resorts are putting marine protected areas so that they're coastal areas, because sometimes the communities, indigenous communities, villages nearby may not have the resources to do this. But because of the collaboration between tourists and communities, they are able to revive some of the traditional knowledge and skills practices, like the tabu or the marine protected areas, while at the same time, the tourist resorts are playing a part also in the protection of the communities. Now, saying this does not mean that everything is going well, because there has been some license given to tourists or investors who have come in and bulldoze our reef structures. And because we have a very active environmental concerns people around the country, we were able to highlight this, call out the government, call whoever gave the license, call out investors, and it's being stopped immediately. So I think for us, it's also, while we are trying to manage the protection of the impacts of climate change, how do we also look at the investment that are taking place, development are taking place in Fiji and other Pacific Island countries that are not creating more environmental problem, which is often a very big challenge, because sometimes investors go directly to chiefs, traditional village chiefs, and governments. They get the approval and continue, while the communities are not aware or not part of the consultation for the establishment of such development or investment. But otherwise, the tourism now in Fiji is contributing to the protection of some of our coastal, particularly because majority of the resorts are along the coastal areas and islands.
Can you tell us what our particular church can do? Not just the people sitting here, although I would like to know, personally what we can do, but our church sitting here.
Thank you. I'll probably refer to the first three P's that I mentioned: prophetic, the pastoral, and the practical. I think the church here, or the Presbyterian Church USA, have continued to support us through the funding projects that we do. There are some projects that have specifically been supported by the Presbyterian Church, which we're thankful for and very grateful and blessed, because if it wasn't for this support, we wouldn't have implemented or supported communities in this work. the practical. I guess the pastoral for me and the prophetic, I was talking to Katie about this on our way here, because of the way maybe the Pacific is shaped or formed, that we can sit with our government leaders on one table and talk about stuff. I wonder if in the US, there's a possibility of churches' voices collectively to address similar issues with your government. US plays a very important role in the negotiation at the UN level. Imagine having the voice of the church to influence that very strong voice. I don't know how, but I think there is, just listening to the International Peacemaker Program, having existed for a number of years with international partners from around the world, there's a lot of support that the Presbyterian Church USA can have if you sit on the table and be able to have this talk with your politicians who make a lot of decisions, not only here, but even shaping some global discussions.
And at some point, we can talk a little more about what the Peace USA does already at the UN level in New York, especially with the women's ministry there, and then also the presence we have in DC. Because there are chaplains we have in DC, so that if our congregation were to take a trip there, they would help connect us with our politicians. We can talk about what affects us here in Illinois and where we see God working in our communities here and around the world. And that's something I haven't gotten to do, but something that I know churches can do. Going once, going twice. Francis, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Shall I pray us out? Let us pray together. Gracious God, we know that we are all your children, all part of your beloved creation. You have made the world and named it good, and tasked us to cultivate and care for this land. God, we give thanks for our neighbors that are only an ocean away, that Francis can be here with us now. And Lord, we lift up the people of Fiji. We ask that you help us to figure out ways to give them strength, to help prevent floods, to be there and partner with them, to feel their grief and loss in our hearts. And Lord, bind us closer together as your children in this time and in the times to come. Amen.
Amen.